Sort of.
Behind all of this. Don't need to see ourselves. I can't make it go on.
Oh, what's that one?
That's a big one.
Oh.
This one's a small one. Doesn't want to go down.
Does the
I
side
don't know where
work?
to put it. Put it over
There
here.
you go. Elegant.
Yeah.
All right.
We don't really have a pointer here. This is the only thing we use for pointing.
Okay.
Need it. It's right
Okay.
there.
Also works as a.
Yeah, you can just hold it with your hand. Or you can use the cursor. That's
Okay.
even better.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, I think we'll get started. Thanks everybody for coming out on a beautiful day. Looks like spring is arriving. Today we're going to have a seminar given by Lark Weller, who's working with the National Park Service as a community planner. And she has a bachelor's degree in ag sociology and anthropology from the University of Minnesota. She also has a master's degree in urban and rural planning from the Humphrey School here at the university. She's had a lot of experience working on the Mississippi River. She co-authored the State of the River report a few years ago. She has worked on ways of increasing the adoption of river protection strategies. She is a communications specialist. She does a lot of outreach, and she works on partnerships with stakeholders. So she's going to tell us a little bit about what she learned in terms of better communication skills with stakeholders.
Great. Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you. And yeah, thank you for coming indoors on one of the first days that it's kind of nice to be outdoors. That's a special treat. Yeah, so I'm glad to talk with you about issues that are really important. Are you all water resource science majors? Is that sort of what you're all coming to this with? Okay. So communicating effectively with the public about our work is a critical issue for all of us. I'm happy to be here to visit with you about some of my thoughts on it. So I'm not a natural resources scientist. I don't have any formal training in communications, so I sometimes feel a little strange talking to groups about effective communication. But I did co-author a piece that seemed to make a number of people happy in terms of communicating scientific, technical, and environmental issues to the public in ways that non-scientists can understand and relate to. So I think that's what brings us here today. This is the cover of the State of the River report, which I co-authored along with Trevor Russell of Friends of the Mississippi River. We've published 2 editions. The first was in 2012 and the second was in 2016, as you see here. I do not welcome questions about when the next one will be happening. That's a little, I've still got PTSD from this, so let's just leave it at the 2016 version. But the State of the River report has been fairly well received and it's been read by many people. Trevor and I have given presentations on it to thousands of people. It's helped lead to legislative changes. It's helped get some environmental issues on people's radar and in the vocabulary of people who probably wouldn't have had those issues on their mind otherwise. So I assume that writing and presenting this report is the main reason that I have been asked here to speak with you today. So informed by my experience helping to create, write, and communicate 2 of these reports over several years, I have a guess at some of the underlying principles that have helped this report feel like effective communication, at least to some segments of the public. And so that's what I will share with you today. I will include the principles all together on one slide at the end, but got to create an impossibly exciting sense of anticipation until then. So I love this graphic, these old maps of sort of charting the natural courses of the Mississippi River over time. I thought it was a helpful graphic to kind of think about all the ways in which communication is informed and good communication happens, and trying to streamline that into just a couple of broad themes. And I think those principles can be categorized generally into the ideas of being humble and being human. So under being humble, I'm lucky because in my role, I rarely know as much as other people in the room. I work with a lot of technical scientific experts, and I rarely am, in that same category. So I'm not an expert. And I'd suggest that people pretend, or if that isn't actually pretending for you, then acknowledge that you're not an expert and see what kind of impact that has with your interactions with the public. For those of you being trained in the sciences, apply the principles of curiosity and being open to change and new information to your interactions with and conversations with and presentations to the public. I know that when I'm at my best, I'm trying to make my communications more about creating an opportunity to come to greater shared understanding, shared mutual understanding, and less about making myself look smarter than the other person or as smart as the other person. I'm trying to learn from those interactions as well when I communicate. So I'm interested in filling us both up with meaningful information, and less so than, shoving information down people's throat. In terms of being human, we know, but I think sometimes we seem to forget that humans are social and emotional beings. This is how we're built to be. And I suggest that we kind of go with it. We allow this. I think that weird things happen when we tell ourselves otherwise, and that our species is going in bad directions when we pretend that in the arms of that approach. I know that I learn best from and can best listen to the kind of human who acknowledges that the human experience is really fundamental to all that we're doing professionally. It's really informing how we're understanding our professional roles. So what if we communicated scientific, technical, and environmental information from that perspective? So the Be Human principles that I'll be speaking with you about are really about showing your humanity, showing your joy, your passion, your collaboration skills, and recognizing and finding ways to honor the humanity of others in your work as well. So let's look at these in more detail. Know your audience. That's sort of a fundamental, it's kind of like location, location, location in real estate. Like know your audience is kind of what we all go to in terms of when we think about communicating to an audience or disseminating information. This is not only about knowing to whom you are communicating, so that's a matter of identification, but it's also a matter of understanding what matters to them. Answer a question that the public has asked and find the right data to answer those questions. That's sort of the approach that we took with the Stay the River report. And in that case, we understood our audience to be members of the public who care about the Mississippi River and elected officials. Those were the groups of people that we wanted to be really landing our message with and having an impact on. So this is a slide from the presentation that we would commonly give to our Stay the River audiences, and this is really the genesis of the Stay the River project. Both the National Park Service and Friends of the Mississippi River, with whom we co-authored this, we interact daily with members of the public, and we are constantly getting these questions. Generally, how is the Mississippi River? And then people want to know things like, can they fish and eat fish that they catch in the river? Can they swim in the river? They hear about pollution getting better or worse, and they just sort of wanted a better understanding about how the Mississippi River is. So we were in the fortunate position of really understanding directly from the public what mattered to them and what they wanted to learn about. Select and craft your content with your audience in mind. For this Stay the River report, this defined every stage of the report. It informed the selection of parameters that we would include. We were careful to include the parameters that would help answer those can I fish in the river and can I swim in the river questions. The report was organized thematically in order to address those questions as a batch, sort of as a theme. We asked ourselves fundamental questions like, will the absence of a certain parameter leave the audience fundamentally uninformed? And we considered issues that we might help to sort of break as breaking news to members of the public. And that was, we had examples of triclosan in our first edition, which became pretty well known after the report. Microplastics and chloride are some of the issues that we helped to lift up in the 2016 edition. So those deliberations that really informed what would be in the report and how the report would be outlined were really about providing value to our audience. Talk with your audience, not at your audience. And there are many ways in which we tried to do this. First and foremost, we really tried to pay attention to using plain language. For those, coming from the scientific and technical communities, from government agencies, that's not the world that we are, well equipped at walking in. We have a lot of lingo and terminology and technical terms that don't mean anything or a lot to the public. So we were trying to really be careful and examine and scrub any terms that might make a regular member of the public feel like they don't know something that they should know. So an example of that in our report about the Mississippi River, we generally in the water resources world, it's very common for us to refer to the locks and dams as both sort of a structural feature, but also sort of a geographic locator along the river. But that's not, locks and dams is a term that, sounds engineering and sort of doesn't really mean a lot to all members of the public. So we tried to, be careful, scrub things like that and refer to it more as the St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam or the Ford Dam and then describe where it was. So kind of moving away from agency language and towards something that we felt the public would have more in their vernacular. Trevor and I had a long-standing disagreement about whether we should include the word evapotranspiration, so that did make the report. We tried to sort of lead up to it in a way, and we just were having a hard time coming up with substitute terms for that. So it's an example of just kind of trying to critically analyze what language you're using and trying to really scrub it of insider terminology to the extent possible. We were trying to write to an 8th grade level for this report, and we really, we studied that and tested that measure regularly throughout the writing. You can also see in this slide a little glimpse of our formatting, which was another attempt to talk with our audience. So a couple of things that I would point out here. One is that for each parameter that was included in the report, we included an overall headline statement and then 2 or 3 bullet points. So that's what, look, I really used the stick. So this was the overall headline and then bullet statements, and those are repeated here on the slide itself. But those we wanted to offer someone who we didn't seriously think that every reader was going to sit down and read the entire report through front to back. So we wanted to give people an opportunity to sort of drop in and out of the report as well. And so those headline and bullet statements were a way that we tried to encapsulate the top line messages for the public, regardless of how much time they could spend with it. We also were careful to use graphics and to make it a visually appealing report as well. Graphics both for the term, both in terms of figures, so providing some data trend, showing data trends, but also just making it a visually appealing layout with color and photographs as well. We also tried to use everyday comparisons for our audience. So we thought about what are the ways in which an audience might recognize your material in their everyday life. One of my favorite examples of how we did this was we discussed river flow as the river's pulse. And we totally stole that from Sean Schottler, if you're familiar with Sean Schottler with the St. Croix River Watershed Research Station. But he gave us a really excellent, I thought it was beautiful, poetic way of describing flow to a general audience. He said the Mississippi River is a living ecosystem, and like many living things, it has a pulse. The natural fluctuations in river flows are the pulse of the watershed. Just like your pulse is symptomatic of what's going on in your body, the pulse of the river tells us about what's going on in the watershed. Flows might go up and down, and that's not necessarily bad, but what we're beginning to see is that the things that are causing changes in flow are also changing the delivery of pollution to the river. So the more we understand about flow, the better we can manage water quality in the Mississippi River. So that was sort of an elegant way to kind of step people into a really complicated but fundamental issue and thing that we measure in order to understand the health of the Mississippi River generally. So think about everyday comparisons that can be made to what you're trying to communicate. So those are the principles that I grouped in the Be Humble category. We can move now to the principles in the Be Human category. I've found that audiences respond well to people who are appropriately enthusiastic. And I'm best suited to communicating with the public when I'm passionate and enthusiastic about my content. Enthusiasm tends to be contagious. And I think so is a lack of enthusiasm. For those of you who've seen Ferris Bueller and can picture the Bueller, like he was passionate about his content, but had no ability to transmit that passion to his audience. So let's look at ways that you can generate, sustain, and refresh your enthusiasm for your work. Work with exceptional people and feed each other's passion. The State of the River report was built on the research, analysis, and work of a really large, distinguished group of scientific advisors. You can see from the alphabet soup of their agencies that they're diverse in their affiliation and disciplines. And this project was an opportunity for them to be called together and work together in ways that they didn't always have an opportunity. So it sort of provided some benefit to our science and technical advisors. So that's one thing. These advisors were extraordinarily generous with their time and their talents. And I believe they were rewarded by seeing their hard work and years of research and analysis and testing being put to use to make a difference in the world. So it was really humbling to me to see what working with partners who can put their passion into their information is like. It's also important to notice that this project was a collaboration between these scientists and technical experts and people like me, each of whom was passionate about their own piece of the puzzle. So we kind of came together and each played our own role in transmitting that passion and that information to the public in meaningful ways. In addition to our science and technical advisors, we worked closely with a graphic designer, with advocates, with educators, and with public outreach professionals. So in that sense, the public was a partner for this project all along. If what you're working on is something that you really want to land visibly to a large swath of the public, you're probably going to need some help doing that. And there's no shame in not doing that yourself. In fact, I think it's really wonderful when people recognize their strengths and when other people offer places where they're not so strong. So along with the development of the report itself, we worked with a communications consultant to conduct proactive media outreach throughout the entire report development process. And this is an awesome screenshot of my file directory for some of the media files, just to give you a sense of sort of how specific and broken down we got with some of our outreach. But we brought this communication consultant in at key points along the way for the entire project so that she understood how our content was shaping up and that could inform her work, but also so that she could help us shape up our work. We worked together over a period of months on talking points, on preparing for a media briefing, both in terms of materials for journalists, but also the event coordination and invitations to the members of the media. And we also worked with her to prepare visits to editorial boards and journalists so that the media was ready for our report once it landed and they had the graphics that they needed in order to help us transmit the stories of the report. So this is all from the brilliant practices of the communication consultant we worked with from day one. So think about how you might finally feel at the end of a long research project, at the end of getting something published into a journal, and then think about having to do this sort of separate outreach media engagement process. Like, I personally would not have energy left for that, right? So to think about working with someone who can really see that as a parallel and equally important part of your project all along is, I think, well advised. So another principle is to help others connect to their passion. This is related to knowing your audience and listening to what's important to them, but I think I'm also suggesting something a step further here. Helping others connect to their passion involves meeting people where they are, finding a way to make it clear how your information fits into their world and into their daily lives. So after we released the first Stay the River report in 2012, we learned that teachers had used it in the classroom to teach students about the Mississippi River. So when we started developing the 2016 Stay the River report, we worked with an educator, again, from the very beginning of our process, to develop a teacher's guide in collaboration with the report itself. So this was going to link the lessons of the report to state education standards. She also conducted outreach to educators so that they knew the product was in the works and could plan their schedules and curricula accordingly. And developing a teacher's guide built in a connection to the report to those among us who are still eager to learn about the world around them, right? So this built in sort of a link between the report and students. It also includes, in addition to sort of straight up content linked to the report itself, it also includes service learning components and sort of experimental components for students to be able to really apply the lessons of the report out in the world. We also developed a stewardship guide, which was meant to give the top 10 actions that people could take at home, in their yards and gardens, and in their communities. And then Friends of the Mississippi River also developed a policy guide, which provided the top 10 actions that decision makers could take to help protect the Mississippi River. So what we were doing with the development of all of these was handing the "so what do I do" question. We were handing information about "so what do I do with all of this," and allowing it to take life off of the page. In my case, working with a partner at Friends of the Mississippi River, who is able to do advocacy work that I'm not as a member of the federal government, that gave the project an additional piece of life, right? That gave it legs beyond what would have happened if it were solely a National Park Service project. A lot of the challenges we write about in the report itself are complex and daunting. It's about increasing pollution in the Mississippi River due to things like agricultural practices, climate change, how we're living and interacting with the land. And people can really feel daunted by that. They care about it, but they just feel overwhelmed by that. So we really were careful and wanted to equip our audience, again, people who we know care about the Mississippi River, with guidance on what they can do to help protect and restore the river and address some of those challenges in their own lives. We know that Minnesotans value clean water and want to do their part for a healthy river, so we created these companion documents to help them know what their part is and to really focus that interest on their part. Finally, I consider this sort of along the lines of put your own oxygen mask on before helping others. Know how you're going to keep your own passion alive. As we said earlier, enthusiasm is contagious, so we need to find ways to sustain and regenerate our own enthusiasm if we want the public to be able to respond to it. Audiences did respond well to the State of the River report for some combination of the things that we've spoken about. This is Trevor, that's me with longer hair. Trevor and I also took this report on an exhausting road show, which really helped to deliver the report to a much broader and larger audience than a standalone paper report would have. This came at a cost to each of us, and we never would have kept doing it if we hadn't have had some enthusiasm for the project. And so, you know, we sort of needed to help build and maintain that enthusiasm together as a team. We developed a rapport that I think have helped audiences see our humanity and see themselves somewhere in all of this a bit more clearly. They're hearing about these issues from people who are clearly humans. And so, like, I like to put this picture up here because check out how Trevor, we have two podiums. Like, Trevor is a total diva and insists on having his own separate podium. So, like, just things like that where, you know, we have a shtick, we have a way of engaging with each other and presenting the information, which is, it helps me personally to be hearing information from another human being. I also love how I'm looking at my presentation in this picture. He's looking at me and he's totally like sneering at me. So it's just, it's a great encapsulation of our experience together. But this brings me to my final point and underlying principle, and it connects to one that we talked about earlier. Trevor Russell himself is an amazing, articulate, brilliant. He connects the big picture to insanely small detail. He's really organized. He's hilarious. So if you can do a project with Trevor Russell or someone like Trevor Russell, do it, and you might enjoy parts of it. So, like, find your Trevor Russell and use those people to help you really do exceptional work and understand how to bring it to the public in a meaningful way. So I promised you I would put all of these principles in one place. So here's the sort of summary slide with a version of those principles. So again, just think about ways to be humble and to be human in your work and in your transmission of your work to the public. Again, these are the underlying principles that I think have had something to do with the State of the River report, having been well received by at least some segments of the public. That's sort of what I have prepared for you today. So I would welcome some conversation. You're welcome to follow up with me and connect with me offline after today, but I would love to also just open it up for questions and discussion. And I'm also always curious about what you all are working on and sort of how you see this relating to what you're working on and informing what you're working on. So thank you. Yes,
okay,
John.
so I'll ask the question.
Yeah.
You have those underlying principles.
Mm-hmm.
Those, I don't remember now, back at the beginning of the presentation, whether you said those just kind of evolved out of this. Did you have some guide to those to start with, or did they just come out as a result of working through this and figuring it out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And do I need to repeat the question?
No,
okay.
should be okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. A combination of both. Some of them were principles that we sort of came into it with. So we knew all along that we were developing this report, which was going to be heavily based on scientific, really technical information for general public 8th grade audience. So the principles around really streamlining the information, plain language, really visual, graphics, heavy presentation of the information were really driving us all along. But some of it has sort of come out along the way in sort of piecing together over the years of experience and both looking back and also just sort of seeing how things have played out along the way. So the things like really connecting to passion, I think that makes intuitive sense to most of us, right? But I think it's something that really became crystal clear to me on reflection and thinking about how much time our technical and science advisors devoted to this project. I'm really astounded and humbled by how much time people gave. And so to think that this was really beyond the call of their normal jobs and of their normal time, So to really think about how you can honor that and how you can promote projects as an opportunity to really stoke their passions is something that sort of makes intuitive sense to me, but I can only name it more clearly on the on the end of our project. So sort of a combination of knowing coming into it that we needed to tend to some of these elements, and then others of them have been things that I've sort of just observed and put thematically from there. Yes, Dave.
Yeah, so how do you communicate differences of opinion? There's a lot of issues that people don't agree on with regards to water resources, whether it's the interpretation of the results or the causes of what's happening. And so how much do you get involved in those kinds of issues, and how much do you try to talk about different perspectives that people may have on the same sets of data?
Yeah, that's a great and very important question, especially for the kinds of topics that we talked about and that you all probably talk about. So that is something that really infused our conversations with our science and technical advisors. Though this was always geared toward a very general public audience, another very fundamental underlying principle was that this was a scientific document, that it had to be scientifically sound and without question. I mean, there will always be question, but it had to be scientifically sound. So the question you're asking came up in everything from the selection of which parameters we would use. Did we have enough long-term data to really show a reliable and statistically sound trend? For a couple of our parameters, the modeling techniques changed halfway through our development process, and so it changed the sort of outcomes of the data, and so we had to really re-examine whether we could continue to use certain parameters given changes in how it would be analyzed. But then so part of that was just informing the selection of the parameters. They had to be something that we felt absolutely, utterly confident in. We also acknowledged that there are questions remaining. So for example, questions around whether some of the flow changes and increases that we're seeing are due are those more linked to changes in climate, or are those more linked to changes on the land through such things as agricultural drainage practices? So we acknowledge those questions, we present those questions in the report itself, and then we say, and here's the data that shows. So Sean and Dan Engstrom at the St. Croix Watershed Research Station have remarkable research that shows what the difference in flow output between the Minnesota River and the St. Croix River are. And so we show these are two river systems that have received the same precipitation changes, but they have remarkably different flow outputs. And here's why: because of the landscape changes that have taken place. So a little bit of sort of informing how and what the data will be going into the report, and then just acknowledging that there are a lot of questions about some of these things, and we kind of walk the audience through answering the scientific answer to those questions. And then, Trevor, again, does a lot of advocacy work, so he is also able to speak to the advocacy work that's taking place at the Capitol, even still today around these issues. So he can sort of, in public presentations, he can respond in a more advocacy-based stance. But really, the report itself stands on solid scientific legs. I think you both had questions.
So I was just going to ask about, you touched on this topic that you use the vernacular that your audience uses.
Mm-hmm.
My study is surrounding runoff
Mm-hmm.
and stormwater, and there are a lot of times when I'm talking to a technical audience, they're snowplow operators, but they're not the kind of technical audience that they're not a scientific audience.
Right.
And I don't really know a lot of their vernacular.
Right.
Right. So it kind of comes with this as a learning process.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how much do you, in deciding the language to use, how much do you rely on intuition and how much do you rely on maybe like survey kind of data, and how much do you say, okay, I think this will work, but let's throw it out in front of the subset and see what they think?
Yeah, I think those are all good and promising approaches. I would say depending on, I mean, time is a luxury. And so if you can really be thinking about those things and have months to kind of hash through some of that, that's a luxury. That's not often the reality, right? So I would suggest a few things. One is you can always fall back on the principle of using examples from everyday life. So that sort of flow being equated to pulse, like that's something that we all have some connection to. So what are the examples like that you can pull on from your work? So that's one thing. Another is, yeah, for sure, surveying, or if you can find professional associations of your community and start to attend those meetings and maybe just do a little 10-minute, hey, I'm working on this project. We'd love to, just bat some ideas around with you and hear what makes sense and what lands well for you. Think about the professional communities and networks that you can reach out to. I think you're well poised here within the university community to reach out to those. Yeah, but then surveying them directly and then just sort of testing materials along the way, I think are both really, really good practices as well. And then it's sort of another fallback for me is always, I know it's different when you're preparing material for the page or for a website or something like that's kind of finished and final, but to really understand, like, I just think about those questions that can help both of us get to that greater shared understanding. So, like, what is it that you ultimately really need to communicate? And what is it that they ultimately really need to know about what you have? So just kind of keep trying to drill down in your own mind what you're trying to answer and address. And think about that from their perspective and ask those questions directly of them, like, how can we figure this out together?
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
So you mentioned to know your audience, and you said that the audience for this was policymakers and people who want to see the river clean, and it's kind of the goal or whatever of the audience. So did you guys primarily present this in Minnesota? Because, like, obviously a lot of your work happened up here. Or did you guys get to go further down the Mississippi River too?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should have, so the national park for whom I work, the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, is a 72-mile stretch of the river here in the Twin Cities metro area. So the report was pretty much focused on things happening within that 72-mile stretch of the metro river. But as we know, water is influenced by things happening everywhere. And our water is being sent on downstream nationally. We do talk about the Gulf of Mexico dead zone in our report because we're where it starts. So we presented largely within the state of Minnesota. However, Trevor, I think, has presented our report to national audiences through consortiums like the Mississippi River Network. I think he's presented to the River Network meetings and conferences nationally. So it's received a smaller, but it's received a national audience. We, as a part of our media outreach, it landed on AP outlets and things like that. So it was also covered, and the findings were covered in news outlets nationally. But to me, one of the exciting pieces is that colleagues in state and national, or state and federal and regional government organizations looked to us to help inform their work around monitoring and conducting analysis and trends work and communicating issues of river pollution to their communities. So the State of the River report ultimately, and we served as advisors to a couple of those sort of regional and federal Water Quality Task Force. So it ultimately ended up informing what other groups nationally were doing. So it sort of landed probably not as widely as it did here in Minnesota, but we did have a national public audience as well as a national agency sort of organizational audience. And that, again, a lot was made possible by our work with our communications consultant, who really helped with that media outreach in a way that we probably wouldn't have been able to. Yes.
You talked about putting on your own oxygen mask first. I imagine there must have been some pretty stressful moments along the way. If there were, what did you do to feed your passion or to stay motivated?
It was, yeah, a combination of trying to understand that there will always be more you can do. And so if you're trying to reach some point where it feels like everything's done, that seems like a fool's errand. So some of that was trying to understand where we needed to draw the line for things. And some of that was just a matter of, hours in the day. We had a publication deadline, and so that all backtracks to certain other deadlines. But part of it was just, insisting that we had some very late nights, but I think we were good at sort of keeping those contained to the last push until we had to go to publication. So things like just trying to keep each other, Trevor and I trying to keep each other in check in terms of trying to maintain some sense of humor, trying to recognize that we start to bug each other after spending so long together, but that it's a part of this process. And really, ultimately, I think we both were really fed by knowing it was helpful to work on the second one, knowing that the first one had been well received, but more importantly, it had really meaningful impact. It had led to policy changes. Minnesota became the first state in the nation to ban triclosan. So we could really be fed by knowing that this was good work that was going to have an impact. So sort of a combination of putting the project itself in its proper place, knowing that really investing our time wisely was going to have some potentially meaningful outcomes, and then just trying to keep each other in check and trying to make it as fun as possible. So.
Trevor's an expert in certain locally brewed water products. That couldn't hurt.
He is. He loves certain things made out of water. Yes. No, that's great. I have a picture of one of the final days. So we have not only the publication deadline, but then the next 2 weeks. Then we have to turn all of our energy to preparing for the press release and a media event. And then we have to turn all of our attention to later that same day putting on a big show at the Science Museum to 800 people. And so it was just one huge deadline after another, and it was just, it was a constant marathon. And so I have a picture from one of those deadlines. I think it was the afternoon we were trying to get ready for the Science Museum presentation. And we had, no one was sleeping. We spent all of our time in that beautiful but stupid conference room at FMR. And I have a picture of Trevor finally went off to nap in one of their rooms or something. And I found a closet and I went and napped in it. And there was but I was in a closet. So I was he's going to freak out if he can't find me here. We're going to the show. And so I just found a whiteboard and I was Trevor, I'm napping in the closet with an arrow. And it was just so you're just looking for ways to take care of yourself and just be straight up about it. So think about those things. You're a human. You've got a full career ahead of yourself. It's not going to do anyone any good if you burn out 10 years into it. What are the ways that you can really give your life to your passion, right? And have it keep feeding you as well. Yes.
I was wondering, someone already asked this, but for the communication specialist, how was that always part of the plan to have them on? And if so, how early on did you guys start involving them in discussing the status quo?
Yeah, that was a plan all along. We used the same woman for both the 2012 and the 2016. She was someone who FMR had used in some other materials or processes and projects. So she was sort of, they had a relationship with her and knew that she could do good work. So we brought her in almost literally from day one. Like we started holding meetings with our science and technical advisors like 2 years before the report was finished, and we started meeting with her around the same time because she really needed to know what this was becoming, and she really needed to help us understand what to, what the public would receive well. So she was pretty much from day one, and totally worth every penny. I think, to really think about, we each have our own areas of expertise, and there's no shame in communications, outreach not being one of them. So really think about what's important to your project really landing well, and find the people who can help you achieve that.
So I was going to ask a question because I'm really interested in visual communication, and I'd just like to know more about the process of getting, you said, a graphic designer to consult with you, and how much work you put in. Were you drafting figures, or were you just talking with them about the processes? How much did they know about the subject matter?
Yeah.
Just generally, like, what was that like? Because you put together some great looking figures, and I want to be able to do the same.
Yeah, I didn't. Bob Spalding did. So yeah, he's this like unicorn for us. So he is a former FMR employee. So he spent 10 years, 20 years working with FMR doing, not 20, so 10, 15 years working with FMR doing sort of like development review and city planning related stuff that could be protective of the river. So he was steeped in FMR's work and practices, and also is an exceptional designer. So we worked with him. Let's see. Yeah, we got data and like Excel tables from our advisors, and he was able to transform them into figures. The one that I showed you of the flow graphics, like he came up, I mean, this is an existing graphic, right? But he was able to really kind of refine that for our particular needs. So I don't know that it's realistic to expect that you'll find someone who can do both, who has that sort of content knowledge and can do the graphic layout. I feel really fortunate that we had Bob to do that for both the reports. And I think, you can probably find ways to improve what we did, right? I think it's still got a lot of text, and there are probably ways that we could continue to refine that. But like having someone who can really help you understand where to cut back and where to really visually have things pop out a little bit better it's just invaluable.
So it's also picking the right opportunities to use that tool.
Yeah.
So if it takes 2 years to pull this together, you're obviously not going to do one in 2020. This is not Olympic year appearance.
Whoops. Right. I guess we missed the window.
About 2024.
How about that year? How about it? Yeah.
You said you didn't welcome questions about that. So.
And so, Pat, you step right in and offer me that.
I waited a long time.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if something happens next. I mean, we've talked about, and a number of our other partners have talked about, like what was missing from this report. We don't get into a lot of sort of social factors and parameters in the report, but we know that that's critical to what's happening with the river as well. But it's a lot of work, and like, Trevor and I both like have where would we find the time? So like, what are the ways in which, it's sort of like I've heard the May Day parade in Minneapolis. This is going to be the last year for the May Day parade because they just need to find a different model of sustainable operations. So I think we can figure out ways to make it happen again, but I think that's a group conversation, right? Yeah.
Bigger team, which would have its own little set of problems.
Right, then you have your other complications that come with that. Yep. But if people, I mean, people have found value in it, and it lives on in that other agencies are using it as models for their work and really using it to inform working with the public on this information too. So even if we don't do it again, it's sort of living on in other ways.
So, extremely valuable for 3,000 class.
Yeah, good. Good. Yes.
Did you do a lot of changes from your 2012 report to 2016 with the layout of your report?
I don't think there were huge layout overhauls. We kept that same, the guidance of the headline statement and bullet, that really is a successful model for us. So we kept that kind of thing. We were more attentive. Pat was one of the people who helped us, the cover for the 2012 report was kind of an afterthought. So it wasn't the greatest image. And so we paid a little more attention to that earlier in the other one. So there are some kind of refinements to the design overall, but I think structurally it's largely the same. And then content-wise, we wanted to strike a balance between giving people an update on some of the issues and parameters that we had shared in the first one, but not just for the sake of, well, we talked about sediment in the first one, so we're going to talk about it again here. It had to provide some new valuable update. And when you're talking about, for many of these things, we're using 20 and 40-year trends. So what news story are you really going to be able to tell 4 years later? So there was a balance there also, and sort of giving people a meaningful update, but really focusing on information that was really telling something new. Yes?
You mentioned that you had to present to 800 people and it was in the news and stuff like that. Did you guys do anything to kind of keep that momentum going forwards, or it wasn't just all this exciting stuff and then nothing back to really exciting stuff? Or just to keep people informed at this level?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did some, again, the second time around that facilitated a little bit of that because there was sort of a buzz around it and people were kind of primed for what was coming their way. But both times we reached out to certain groups that we know we wanted to target because we knew that their audience was our audience, right? And so we reached out to them ahead of time to line up some presentations and conversations, and then that just kind of snowballed and became its own thing. So a little bit of planning some of that ahead of time and then being able to respond to requests that came in once the new one had landed.
So how long was your public presentation released in September of 16?
Mm-hmm.
Went for 6 months? 12?
We have been asked to do one in June, so they're still trickling in. The bulk of them for sure happened within the first year afterward, and there's heavier in the early part of that, but they continue to trickle in. Yes.
If you've ever run across this, but if you publish something or spoken somewhere and then kind of realize after the fact, I don't like the way that I presented this information or this concept. How do you sort of acknowledge that and then pivot to communicating the correct way with, new people and then the people who already had the information that you gave first?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of, there must be examples of that. I think that would come up primarily around sort of audience discussion and questions and how we respond to questions with audience and presentations. And so you don't necessarily get a chance to kind of do an addendum and correction to that. I think it's all just sort of informing how you'll be prepared to respond next time. And I'm struggling to think of a specific example that would classify here. I'm sure there are many, and I'm just sort of a little removed from it and just having a hard time recalling them. I'm sure Trevor's made mistakes all over the place, so you could ask Trevor and he'd just have a laundry list of all his mistakes. But I mean, that's another benefit actually of having the team, right? Is that we can kind of step in for each other and feel like people ask ag-related policy questions all the time, and I can't really go very far with that. So Trevor would be able to step in and take that on. So that's another benefit of having the team is that, we can sort of, I don't know if correct is the answer, but just kind of step in and help each other out. But yeah, we were careful to kind of like informally debrief each time and just be like, how did that go? What should we keep in mind? What did we learn from that group? So I feel like it's a rather informal understanding of an answer to your question. Yeah.
All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you all. Good to be with you. Should I stop sharing this?
I'll take care of it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I remember.
Yes.
What are you doing now?
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
We did a study on that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No,
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. Excuse me.
I might grab a slot machine and then friends were working with us for years. That they would like I'm gonna see her tomorrow. One of my friends at the union.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. My friend loves to see the Vampire
Yeah.
Slayer.